Hello, this is Adam with Wheel Guns for Wheelmen, and today we're going to be discussing the Kyle Rittenhouse trial. Closing arguments are set to begin tomorrow, which is Monday the 15th. Now, normally for my videos, I don't use notes because I don't like reading off notes. It's just not very organic. Normally I just do a single take and say whatever's on my mind. Here, I'm going to use notes. I'm a lawyer, and I know that when discussing law, getting your facts straight is very, very important. I do not want to misstate anything. Now, this video is going to be a legal analysis of the trial. I did watch about 4 different videos from different angles, 3 of the first incident, 1 of the second, and then I listened to witness testimony and read some transcribed portions as well. I, however, am not the jury. I have not sat through the entire trial. Do not have that luxury. Do not live in that state. I'm also a criminal defense attorney, but again, I'm a criminal defense attorney in Idaho, not Wisconsin. I'm not as familiar with their law, and this is not to be taken as legal advice. Just my opinion based on the facts that I've seen, either in writing or on video. And this is a legal analysis video, but this is a very political case as well. I do want to note, and just get out of the way, my personal feelings out of the way at the beginning. Mr. Rittenhouse, to some, is just a monster. He went, sought out conflict, and just shot a bunch of people with a scary AR-15. And other people are saying, no, he's a hero. He went to protect private property from looters. I don't take either of those positions. I don't think he's a hero. I think that the kid is kind of a moron. I think that his parents should be punished in some way for letting their child take an AR-15 when he's 17 years old and probably has no combat experience or really much real world experience at all, and go into a riot zone where there are people engaged in acts of violence. I don't think that was wise of his parents. I don't think that was wise of him. One of my main things I teach my students is best way to avoid getting killed in a gun battle or any sort of fight is to avoid fights in general. If you see trouble, go the other way. Be aware of your surroundings. If you think trouble might be coming, go the other way. Try to avoid conflict. If you can't avoid conflict because it seeks you out, that's one thing. But if you can't avoid it, it's best to avoid it. Easiest way not to get injured is to not put yourself in a position to be injured. Even if you are in the right, doesn't matter. So that's my personal opinion. I think the kid's stupid for doing what he did. But legally speaking, here goes. Now, the state called over 24 witnesses, while the defense only called a few. Mr. Rittenhouse took the stand in his own defense. He also had a use of force expert come and testify. But the majority of the facts I'm relying on come straight from the defense witnesses, or the state's witnesses' own testimony. Either videos presented by the state through their witnesses, or just testimony of what those witnesses saw and heard. And based on the state's own witnesses, I can tell you right now, I do not believe he is guilty of murder, manslaughter, anything of that nature. I believe it's self-defense. He may be guilty of some misdemeanors like being out after dark or having an AR-15 or whatever. But of the felonies, I do not believe he's guilty. And here's why. So I'm going to start with the second individual. He was shot and killed, and the third individual who was shot and not killed. Those are easier to analyze than the first one. So we'll start with the second and third people. For context, somebody chased Mr. Rittenhouse. That's the first person. He shot that person. We're not going to talk about that quite yet. Then, right when he shot that person, he heard another person fire a shot into the air. Or just heard him fire a shot, doesn't know where he fired it into. It's chaotic, it's night. There are multiple people chasing him down, and he's running away, trying to get to the police, he says. He stumbles, is on the ground. The second person, Mr. Huber, who is now deceased, struck him with his skateboard and grabbed at the rifle that Mr. Rittenhouse had. And when he did that, Mr. Rittenhouse shot him in the chest, fearing for his life, because the guy just struck him with a skateboard, and then he was going for his weapon. If someone gets a hold of your weapon, they can easily turn it on you. The fact that he attacked him with a skateboard as he was retreating means that he was the aggressor. So I believe that's self-defense. The third person, who survived being shot, admits that he pointed a pistol at Mr. Rittenhouse. He said he didn't do so intentionally, that he was just holding the handgun. But he did think that Mr. Rittenhouse was an active shooter and he was near him. Again, we'll discuss the legal standard in a little bit, but I believe that's self-defense as well. Now the first person, let's discuss the facts. Again, we'll get to the legal standard in just a minute. The first person, Mr. Rosenbaum, is a little more difficult to analyze. It's undisputed that Mr. Rosenbaum, at the moment he was shot, was unarmed, and that's what we call bad facts for the defense here. But I believe that this is also self-defense. And here are the facts that I'm going to base that analysis on. Video shows Mr. Rosenbaum chasing Mr. Rittenhouse through a car dealership. Mr. Rittenhouse, according to all the witnesses, had not attacked Mr. Rosenbaum or anyone else at that moment. Indeed, video showed, and witnesses backed up, that Mr. Rosenbaum had kind of waited in ambush behind like a car or something and popped out. Witnesses also testified. Witness Ryan Balch for the prosecution testified that Rosenbaum had previously made ominous threats within earshot of Rittenhouse. Prosecution witness Richie McGinnis said Rosenbaum said, "Fuck you," and reached for Rittenhouse's gun right before he got shot. So he threatened him previous to the chase, and then at the end of the chase, when he reached for the gun, which we'll get to, he said, "Fuck you." Now, video shows that Mr. Rosenbaum also was holding an object during the chase and threw it at Mr. Rittenhouse. Mr. Rittenhouse had seen him with a chain earlier that day and thought that that's what was being thrown. Turns out it was a bag, but what appearances matter more than what actually happened, and we'll get to that. But at the end of the video, it shows that Mr. Rosenbaum, or that Mr. Rittenhouse comes up to some cars, gets somewhat cornered. I wouldn't say he's completely cornered, but he has to slow down, and Rosenbaum's gaining on him. He wheels around. The object's been thrown at him. Mr. Rosenbaum is reaching for Mr. Rittenhouse's AR-15. Mr. Rittenhouse says at that moment he thought he was going to take his AR and follow through with the ominous threats from earlier that evening, take it from him and shoot him and other people like him. And so he shot him. He had about, watching the video, maybe a second to make that, that decision. It's literally a split-second decision. And he shot him 3 or 4 times in like the chest area, torso. Now, the standard here, and that's what I want to get to, and that's what a lot of people don't understand, is objectively reasonable. Basically, a jury is going to be asked, was it reasonable based on the facts that he either knew or thought he knew? And if there's a mistake of fact, is that a reasonable mistake of fact? Clearly, if he thought he had a gun, but he was holding like a stuffed animal, that would probably not be reasonable. If someone's holding a toy gun, however, and you think it's a real gun, that is reasonable. So it's about what he perceived to be the facts and whether or not his response to those perceived facts is reasonable. And here, I think that in all 3 instances, he is justified. The first two, or the first 2 I analyzed, so the second person and the third person. The second person was actively attacking him with a skateboard and trying to take his deadly weapon from him, which could be used against him since he's attacking him with a skateboard. He's an aggressor. It's a fair assumption to make. And so that's justified. Second person's pointing a Glock pistol or some other sort of semi-automatic handgun at him and is involved in this melee. And regardless of whether or not that person actually intended to shoot him, which his testimony was he wasn't intending to, it's not up to me to try to guess what that person who's pointing a pistol at me is about to do. It's fair to assume they're going to shoot me, and I can shoot back. Now, interestingly, and this is the main point of this video actually, the objectively reasonable standard actually applies to everybody. So if they had decided to prosecute the third person who survived with aggravated assault for pointing the pistol, that person would also have a good self-defense argument. And if the second person, Mr. Huber, had not died, he would have a good self-defense argument for hitting him with a skateboard, because both of them perceived him to be an active shooter, terrorist, whatever, the bad guy. And from what they've seen and heard, and the facts at their disposal suggest he is a bad guy, he needs to be stopped. But just because they think he's a bad guy doesn't mean he is a bad guy. But that also doesn't mean that they're not justified. So in reality here, everybody is justified because of what they perceive to be reality. It's perceived is what matters. And there's a case out of Colorado that recently came down, well, the decision to not charge an officer came down, I should say. And in that in that case, the Colorado police officer showed up on scene. There were reports of an active shooter who had just ambushed and killed a cop. They saw somebody holding a gun. They shot that person. It turns out that the person that the cop shot actually had shot the person who ambushed the cop and was the active shooter. So the police shot the hero. But the police officer was not charged recently. They declined to charge him after investigating everything that happened, because that officer reasonably believed that the person who ended up being the hero was the active shooter. So it was self-defense / defense of others to shoot him. In other words, hindsight's 20/20, but that's not the legal standard. It's what was objectively reasonable based on the facts at the people's disposal at the time in question. And here, Mr. Rittenhouse retreated. I would like to point that out. In all these instances, he's retreating. He ran from Mr. Rosenbaum, and he didn't start a fight. He didn't start the altercation. Mr. Rosenbaum attacks him and chases him, and he retreats. So I don't know if they have a duty to retreat in Wisconsin, but even if he did retreat, so he satisfied that duty if one exists. Here in Idaho, we have a stand your ground law. I could just shoot Mr. Rosenbaum as soon as I perceive him ambushing me and trying to take my gun. Especially if I see him holding a chain and he's made death threats or whatever earlier in the evening. As for people hitting me with a skateboard while I'm retreating, yeah, I think I could shoot them too if they're also going for my gun. And then the person pointing a Glock at me, I can shoot them as well. Again, this is very tragic. Those people, like I said, all have a good self-defense argument, so if they had been charged, they would be in the right too. So no one here is really in the wrong, and that's what makes it tragic. Except for maybe Mr. Rosenbaum. He started this. Remember, everyone's painting Kyle Rittenhouse as the villain, but Mr. Rosenbaum chased down a kid after making death threats to him, threw something at him, and tried to take his gun. That person started it. He caused this tragic chain of events. He is dead, so he's not going to get punished any more than he already is. But really, I feel he's the only one here who's actually committed a crime. Everyone else is just a misunderstanding at that point. And I would also, this is getting to be a long video, but this trial is just, the prosecutor, for one, the whole office, should be ashamed of themselves because their own witnesses proved self-defense beyond a reasonable doubt, which is the opposite of what they need to do, which is prove that it wasn't self-defense, but indeed homicide of some sort, murder, manslaughter, beyond a reasonable doubt. So it's a waste of money. You had a 2-week trial, wasted all those, millions of dollars probably, put everyone through all this, jurors, witnesses, Mr. Rittenhouse, for what? To lose, to get some brownie points politically so you get reelected or something? I don't know, that's just stupid. It's a waste of money. I'm a libertarian, so I hate waste and inefficiency and doing things for virtue signaling. 2, prosecutors should be ashamed because they committed misconduct that was extremely egregious, hence why they got yelled at by the judge. And all the media, of course, being left-wing, criticizing the judge, but the judge was correct. Prosecutor commented on post-arrest right to remain silent, invoked by Mr. Rittenhouse. You cannot comment on that. You learned that in law school. This prosecutor, if he's handling a murder case, should know better, or else he shouldn't be handling this murder case. 2, he ignored a pretrial in limine order, it sounds like. In other words, the judge said, you can't bring up this evidence from what happened 2 weeks prior, and he tried to bring it up. Can't do that. You should ignore a judge's order. And then finally, he commented on another witness's decision to lawyer up, and the judge had said not to, and then he tried to ask it a second time. So the judge was right to be frustrated. This prosecutor is undermining the court and also violating basic constitutional due process principles. In my opinion, it should be a mistrial with prejudice because of these egregious oversteps by the prosecution. It's misconduct, and it should have been a mistrial. Double jeopardy should have attached, so he couldn't be retried on all counts, in my opinion. All the felony counts, at least. And then finally, if he does get convicted, which I can't see in any sane world how this man could be convicted when he's simply not guilty from the prosecutor's own witnesses' testimony. You have apparently jury intimidation and intimidation of the judge. Of the jury, it appears to be some either Black Lives Matter or George Floyd related people trying to intimidate them into convicting Kyle Rittenhouse. So if he gets convicted, I think he has a good appeal issue because this whole trial is kind of a farce by the prosecutor and by the media. The judge is the only one who's at all holding up due process and fairness, and I commend that judge. And these are my thoughts. Please like and subscribe if you want more legal analysis or cooking videos or gun videos. Thank you.